Here we go. So the portion today is the portion Teitze. If you have the Eitz Chaim, it's page 1112. If you have another edition of a Chumash or a Jewish Bible, you're looking for Deuteronomy, chapter 21, beginning with verse 10. So if you have a Chumash, it'll break up the chapter that way as a new Torah portion. If you have a Bible, it might not necessarily do that. So it's chapter 21, verse 10. Just as a rabbi, I must tell you that the further along we get into the book of Deuteronomy, that means the closer we get to Rosh Hashanah, and the stress and anxiety increase. Though this year, high holidays will be very different. There's a lot of discussion on my conservative rabbi listserv. We call it RavNet, where rabbis are talking about and discussing, especially since Zoom had a major outage on Monday. By the time we had Minyan, it was all done in the evening, but in the morning, a lot of people were affected by that they were thinking that they're recording the high holiday services. So not even doing it live, not live streaming, not Zooming live, but rather recording and just making a recording of the service available for people. So this was not an option that we considered in our religious committee. We are doing it live, but abbreviated on Zoom. So that information hasn't gone out yet. The time has gone out. The Zoom link you'll get in a little bit, like the week before Rosh Hashanah, but you should understand that our service is going to be a shorter service, knowing that the general accepted idea is people just have about a 2-hour attention span for Zoom. And that's what people have found across the board, no matter what kind of Zoom it is. After 2 hours, we're kind of like, we're overloaded by the what's involved in paying attention to something happening on Zoom. So our service is essentially going to be Musaf. It'll start with prayers for country, Israel, and peace. And then my sermon on Sunday, prayers for country, Israel, peace, shofar. And then my sermon, and then Musaf with just doing the Amida out loud. No silent Amida. So Cantor Adina and I figure that will be about 2 hours. The evening service will be the same evening service. It's about a 45-minute service, so we'll do that the same way, both nights of Rosh Hashanah. Kol Nidre, we figure we can, the Kol Nidre service that we normally do is about 2 hours. So that it's usually 2.5, but since we're not taking the Torahs out, and so that will cut some time down. And then Yom Kippur, also Yom Kippur morning will be 2 hours. We'll have a 1-hour study session in the afternoon, and then 2 hours at the end, 5:30 to 7:36 actually is when Yom Kippur is over. So anyway, that's our plan, and I'm sorry for the tangent. Just by saying the name Teitze, it brings high holidays to my mind, and I start becoming tense. So the thing about Teitze is that many of the rabbis throughout history look to the Torah portions to understand what the mitzvah or the mitzvot are that from Jewish tradition that are from where they are derived, right? In other words, how many mitzvot do we get out of this Torah portion? So for some rabbis, that's the be-all and end-all of interpreting the Torah, as opposed to, what are the values that we're learning from this parsha? What are the religious concepts that we're learning for this parsha? There are other rabbis throughout the centuries that have focused on that, but for the Jewish legal tradition over the centuries, one major thing is to understand where the 613 commandments come from. So it just so happens that, and there isn't a definitive list of the 613 commandments. In other words, if you look to Maimonides from the late 1100s, his list of 613 commandments is slightly different from Nachmanides, who lived 100, 150 years after Maimonides. And there are a few rabbis over the centuries. So there is this concept in the Talmud that there are 613 commandments. But the Talmudic rabbis did not then list what the 613 commandments are. They also said, why are we, a traditional food for Rosh Hashanah is a pomegranate. So in other words, you're supposed to say blessings that you don't normally say for the opportunity to say Shehecheyanu at your Rosh Hashanah dinner table. So you put foods out that are a little bit unusual and different from the normal types of food that you have out. So one tradition is to have pomegranates on the table and to eat a pomegranate. Why? Because if you open the pomegranate, a ton of seeds in there. The rabbis say there are 613 seeds in every pomegranate. So eating a pomegranate on Rosh Hashanah reminds us of our commitment to the 613 commandments, and the blessing is, may we be able to observe the 613 commandments this year, which is impossible to do because the temple is destroyed. A vast majority of the commandments relate to the sacrifices offered and the whole sacrificial system in the temple in Jerusalem. So without the temple, the most we can do in a year is maybe 300 or 400 of the 613. And then also, since most of us are not a Kohen, the mitzvah of Duchanin is a mitzvah, right? So the blessing that the Kohen recites, or the Kohanim recite on the bima before doing the blessing of the congregation, there's an Asher Kitshanu B'mitzvotav blessing that the Kohen recites. So that's one more that an average Jew cannot do. So if you're not a Kohen, it's impossible to do all 613 commandments. If you are a Kohen, it's only if you're a Kohen that you're able to theoretically do all 613. But without the temple standing, we get nowhere near that. All of that being said, 72 of the 613 commandments are found in this week's Torah portion. So the most mitzvot of any Torah portion in the entire Torah are in this week's Torah portion. Some of them we haven't heard about before and previously in the Torah. Some are new to this portion, and some are reiterations of those mentioned earlier. So the bulk of the focus of this week's Torah portion is on, as the Eitz Chaim has it, right under the Hebrew in English on 1112, miscellaneous laws. So that's the best that our editor could say about how to summarize and understand the laws here. Not civil law, not marriage law, but it's a whole bunch of laws on a whole bunch of different topics. Okay, so that's one thing we need to understand about the portion Teitze, that more than 10%, so 72 of 613, what's the percentage? I'm terrible at math. Somebody else can figure out what percent of 613 is 72. I think if I took a moment on pencil and paper, I could figure it out, or do it on my calculator on my iPhone, but somebody else can do that. And let me just admit Rita Rubenstein to our discussion today. Hi, Rita. And okay, so we're at the portion is Teitze, page 1112 in the Eitz Chaim, or whatever Chumash you have, Deuteronomy chapter 21, beginning with verse 10. So I want to look below the line for some initial comment. Wait a second. 11.7%. Thank you, Doreen. Okay. So below the line for Teitze. Throughout this parsha, with its diverse assemblage of laws, more than in any other parsha. One theme is prominent: the irreducible dignity and worth of a human being. Even the most marginal members of society, such as the criminal or the female war captive, are fashioned in the image of God and are to be treated accordingly. So let's understand, let's just take a look at the very beginning, the first Aliyah. So I'm going to read verse 10 through 21 in English. And let's see if we agree with the editor here that these laws talk about the irreducible dignity and worth of a human being. So this is how the portion begins, the first Aliyah. When you take the field against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your power, and you take some of them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire her and would take her to wife, you shall bring her into your house, and she shall trim her hair, pare her nails, and discard her captive's garb. She shall spend a month's time in your house lamenting her father and mother. After that, you may come to her and possess her, and she shall be your wife. Then, should you no longer want her, you must release her outright. You must not sell her for money. Since you had your will of her, you must not enslave her. Okay, again, keep in mind the irreducible dignity and worth of human beings, and whether this law highlights that. Part 2, if a man has 2 wives, one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the unloved one, when he wills his property to his sons, he may not treat as firstborn the son of the loved one in disregard of the son of the unloved one who is older. Instead, he must accept the firstborn, the son of the unloved one, and allot to him a double portion of all he possesses. Since he is the first fruit of his vigor, the birthright is his due. Okay, so it gets into the complicated, and I'll get back to this in a moment. Just keep in mind a man having more than one wife, and the oldest of all the children is from a wife that the husband does not love. He does not have the option of transferring the birthright to another child. And part 3, and I'm saying it as part 3 in a moment because there's a comment on below the line on 11:12 that kind of connects these 3 what seemingly different paragraphs. If a man has a wayward and defiant son who does not heed his father or mother and does not obey them even after they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his town at the public place of his community. They shall say to the elders of his town, this son of ours is disloyal and defiant. He does not heed us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Thereupon the men of his town shall stone him to death. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. All Israel will hear and be afraid. Okay, so the irreducible dignity and worth in human beings. I would argue not necessarily so from these 3 paragraphs. If the son, our rebellious child, even if they are rebellious, the irreducible dignity and worth of a human being would mean do not stone anyone to death. Because if you're allowed to do that, then it shows how not worth and how not irreducible their dignity is. How can you, if all human beings are created equal, then a captive woman should still be equal to you. You should not be allowed to treat her in the way that's described here. And if you have more than one wife, the idea that, well, first of all, you should love all your wives equally, which gets to the point that for 1,000 years, Jewishly, it has been against Jewish law to have more than one wife. And that's it took a long time for that to reach the Yemenite Jewish community, by the way, when after the State of Israel was established in 1948, a couple of years later, they had Operation Magic Carpet, Israel did, to take the Jews of Yemen out of Yemen to Israel. So the Jews of Yemen, one of the oldest continuously functioning Jewish communities in the world, that kind of like lived in a vacuum, really not in, since the time of Maimonides, who there are letters that we have published and left from Maimonides. He had an ongoing correspondence with the Jews of Yemen. And the Jews of Yemen followed, to 1948, followed Maimonides as their rabbi. And so their community saw Maimonides as their rabbi, and their practices were based on Maimonides. And since Maimonides was a Sephardi rabbi, and therefore the Jews of Yemen were Sephardi, the men were allowed to have more than one wife. So here are all these people coming in these airplanes to Israel with men, many of the men having more than one wife. And since the law of Israel was you're only allowed to have one wife, the question at the time was what to do with these. Was obviously they're grandfathered in. They weren't told to divorce their wives, but everybody in Israel today, Sephardi or Ashkenazi, have to, are required by Israeli law, not Torah law or Talmudic law, but Israeli law, that you're only allowed to have one wife. But it was an edict from an Ashkenazi rabbi 1,000 years ago who said that from now on, Ashkenazi men can only marry one wife. And the Sephardi rabbis did not follow that edict. But today, everyone in the Jewish community agrees with that edict. So the idea of here from the Torah, that if a man has two wives, clear. Jacob had two wives. Abraham had two wives at the same time, Sarah and Hagar. And then after Sarah died, he married a third woman, Keturah. Moses had one wife. I'm going through Jewish history of people, noted people with more than one wife. King David had more than one wife. King Solomon had hundreds of wives. So it's legislated in the Torah that it's okay. So I can't understand, I can't give you the underlying value as to why, because society is such for 1,000 years that we are monogamous. You can't remember in polygamous Jewish times what would be the value for a man to have more than one wife. Like, why would that be something to do? Is it only wealthy people that would have more than one wife? Could it be a family issues, that maybe there's a cousin who went unmarried and perhaps then somebody was asked to take her on as another wife in order to provide for her, because women at this time were supported either by their father or by their husband. And the older they are, and let's say their father died and this woman is not married, who's going to support this woman? So an element, I guess, a major element of polygamy is the idea of supporting more, being able to support women who couldn't support themselves. That would be, I think, the major reason for why polygamy exists. It's not anything sexual, that, in other words, to satisfy the man's sexual drive. And it's, I think it's mainly from the financial perspective, the idea of supporting women that way. With that being said, there's these three paragraphs that seem to be independent of each other. The interesting thing is that if you look below the line, how the Eitz Chaim connects these three paragraphs. These three cases are thematically related. A soldier in the heat of battle covets a female prisoner and under power of lust marries her. So again, going against what I just said about what a reason for polygamy would be, that it's not about lust. Here, okay, if it is about lust, a soldier in the heat of battle taking a woman captive and marrying her, so then the result would be, in the end, he will lose feelings of affection for her and for the children he fathers with her. So let's say marries her, already has a wife, doesn't have children yet, but has a child with this captive woman who becomes his wife, and that child is his firstborn, but he loses affection for her. That leads to the second paragraph. And then that child, because you hate the mother now, you're going to hate the progeny of that mother as well. Just emotionally, it makes sense that you would project feelings that you have towards one person onto their children as well. That those children would grow up disrespectful of their parents. So the Midrash connects these three, and then you lead that will lead you to want to have your rebellious child executed. So it's just interesting that the Midrash sees a reason to try to connect these three paragraphs when really independently they can exist of each other and talk about three different kinds of laws here. But it gets to the idea, one of the things that we learned from this is how Jewish values can grow, evolve, and even change so much over time that we wouldn't even consider these as options in Jewish life today. In other words, when Israel does battle, prisoners are taken, but there's no thought at all. And that there are Geneva Convention rules about what to do with prisoners, right? So there's no sense that if you're going to war today and you conquer territory, that you are going to conduct that is, using Israel as an example. There's no way that Israeli soldiers would say, like the Roman army did, okay, now let's rape the inhabitants, the women of this town that we just conquered, and let's take these women captive. That's just not something that countries that subscribe to the Geneva Convention do. Okay, we know that warring tribes do this today. ISIS does this today. But I'm talking about armies of countries that are that subscribe to the Geneva Convention do not do this. So this is not something that you would even think would enter into the spiritual, religious, legal system of the Jewish tradition, because it just doesn't it wouldn't even come to mind that this would be something to consider, which means that it was something to consider 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago in Jewish law, when these were the normal rules of battle. Then this is the Jewish way of having battle, doing battle back then. But it's nowhere near anything that we would do today, so it already seems anachronistic, if not barbaric, to say that this is included in the Torah. And then the next paragraph about a man having more than one wife and what to do with the children, again, that's something that just the Ashkenazi Rabbi Gershom, that was his name, Gershom, from a town in Germany 1,000 years ago, he's the one who promulgated the edict for Ashkenazi Jewry that from now on, men can only have one wife. So where did he have the power to do that when the Torah specifically says that you can have more than one wife? Who's Rabbi Gershom to say to go against the Torah? Torah says you can have more than one wife. It says if a man has two wives, not that a man should have two wives. If a man has two wives, it means it's permitted to have two wives, and it's permitted to have more than two wives as well. So who's Rabbi Gershom to go against something specifically in the Torah? But there is certainly within Talmudic rabbinic tradition, rabbis have the authority to claim that we are interpreting law now differently than how the Torah presents it. And probably because if it says if a man has two wives, not a man should have two wives. So because of how the Hebrew is phrased, made it a little bit easier for Rabbi Gershom and for Jewry to accept that edict. No more polygamy, monogamy is the Jewish way from now on. And then also with the third paragraph about the rebellious child, Barbara will remember this from Talmud class, and Rita as well, from Talmud class many years ago. We studied the section in the Talmud that focused on this section and the conditions that the rabbis required for this to be something that the Sanhedrin, the rabbinic court, would actually follow through on. All the conditions that they added here made it nearly impossible, if not impossible, to follow this law. So if a man has a wayward and defiant son who does not, sorer umoreh. So those are the two Hebrew words. So the rabbis define what sorer and moreh, and does not heed his father or mother and obey them even if they discipline him. No, it says there's also there's something about being a drunkard. Yes, a glutton and a drunkard in verse 20, right? So here's something that I remember from that Talmudic discussion. A glutton and a drunkard. So the rabbis say, so first they say, if your son does not heed, so how old does your son have to be in order to be considered a rebellious child that would be subject to being executed? And the rabbis say that a son has to, for this particular law, it's only between the age of 12 and 6 months and 13 and a day. So 13 and a day becomes bar mitzvah. Technically, you're not responsible for your son anymore. Your son is responsible for his own actions. So it wouldn't be considered then in a category of ben, son. And then younger than 12 and 6 months, well, he's too young to be considered part. So it's only in that 6-month window. That's number one. And then the glutton and drunkard, what is he a glutton? Like, what is he overeating on? And the rabbis say, it's particular kind of meat. It's a kind of meat that you get from, that is prepared in a particular style. And I forget exactly what that, so it's only about that meat. So if your son likes Twinkies and is a glutton on Twinkies, then it does, and fits all the other things. No, you can't execute him because he's a glutton on Twinkies and not a glutton on meat. It has to be meat. And then, and a drunkard, it's a particular kind of wine. So if your son likes vodka or bourbon, well, that's okay. But if it's a particular red wine that the rabbis say, then that is the definition here of drunkard. So we might say, who are the rabbis to come up with these stipulations and minutia to fill out the category here to explain and it's all about the rabbis not wanting to execute anybody. They do this also with murder. There have to be 2 witnesses. the two witnesses have to warn the person about what they're about to do, and that if they do it, they will be subject to execution. So who in the heat of the moment thinks to, it's like those commercials on TV where, you have the fine print on the bottom of the screen to be the legal disclaimer, or you have somebody talking really fast doing in the commercial, doing that legal disclaimer, right? You know what I'm talking about. So imagine being of that mind, let's say just based on my screen, how I see Saul and I are the witnesses to Howard about to murder somebody. So Saul and I both were, so the chances of there being two witnesses to a premeditated murder, that's unlikely, right? So if Howard is premeditating murdering somebody, he's going to be sure that there aren't witnesses there because he wants to get away with it. So the idea that there have to be two witnesses for Howard, in this case, to be caught and brought to trial and executed, and both Saul and I, or one of us, would have to remember to warn Howard, what you're about to do, Howard, is against Jewish law, and know that you would be subject to execution if you do this. It's some such formula like that. And if it wasn't done in that way, in that legal way, Howard, watch out, or stop, Howard, that's not a warning. And the warning then wasn't considered being given, and Howard wouldn't be executed. It's not that the rabbis say murder is okay. Murder is still wrong. It's just that the rabbis didn't want to execute anybody. So for them, the rabbinic value was, we don't want to execute. We just don't want to do that. We place value of life higher than the law that permits us to execute. So we don't want to do that. So we're not saying that these laws we're not omitting these laws from the Torah. We're not deleting them, which the rabbis could have done. They say, no, we're going to keep it here, but we're going to interpret it in such a way to make it impossible to follow through on. And for the rabbis, that was a legitimate way to do it. Not all of the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud agreed with that premise. There was no rabbi who said, I disagree with that, I'm getting out of here, and I'm starting my own different branch of Judaism that is a literal branch of Judaism. Nobody did that. Everybody agreed that it was their right, and they had the authority to interpret the Torah in that way, to say that values can change, laws can change over time, and that's legitimate, and that is Jewish, and God wants us to do that. And they come up with stories as well, the rabbis do in the Talmud, of how they claim God is agreeing with them about this, right? And so there's a famous story that I've quoted many times about one rabbi saying that that he's right, and all the rabbis are saying, no, you're wrong. And that one particular rabbi said, well, I'm going to prove it by making these miracles happen. Trees move, the stream changes direction, the walls of the rabbinic academy start caving in, and the other rabbis are making it all stop. And then that one rabbi says, he gets a voice from heaven to say that he's right. And the other rabbis say, no, we don't listen to voices from heaven anymore. And the rabbis have in the story saying that what happened in heaven that day when all this happened, what was God doing? God was laughing and saying, my children have defeated me. In other words, they have not overpowered, but they have taken upon themselves this authority, and God's like agreeing with the rabbis. So that story, which is in the tractate Baba Metzia, becomes the classic story and the foundational story for this whole idea of how the rabbis have the right to interpret the Torah in this way. And so, when you get a book like Living a Year According to the Bible, or something like that Bruce, I forget who was the guy who tried to live a year exactly as to just based on what the Torah says. It's not a Jewish thing to do. Some of the things in here are just not done today in Jewish practice, like having more than one wife, or executing a defiant son, and other kinds of laws and mitzvot that we see throughout the entire Torah. And that we should not be surprised by that Judaism is not a literal religion. And when the ultra-Orthodox claim to be Torah true, even they are not Torah true, because Torah true means you're going to follow law based on what the Torah says. Well, no, we don't do that. We follow laws. The Torah is the foundation for the mitzvot today, but it's not read literally. It has never been read literally by the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud, and for 2,000 years. That's just the nature of what Jewish practice is, and that's why Judaism is as multifaceted as it is today. You go from one conservative synagogue to another, practice will be slightly different. That's because each rabbi, each community has a slightly different take. Like just about what are synagogues doing now in the COVID-19 pandemic? How are synagogues conducting services, right? So many conservative synagogues are like us. We are now, but when we started, we were just live streaming, right? Because I was still of the pre-COVID Shabbat halachic mindset that I had, that we shouldn't be using computers or encouraging people to be using computers on Shabbat. But live streaming, okay, since we were doing that before, we'll keep doing the live streaming. But then I realized that's just not enough. People do need to see each other, right? Even though if I were live streaming this class, it would be really weird for me just to be talking to the camera without seeing all of you. It makes it easier for me to be teaching, seeing all of you in front of me. And so it makes it easier for Cantor Adina and I to be davening the service, seeing the congregation in front of me. And it makes it more uplifting for all of you to see each other as a community. And so, but not every synagogue, not every conservative synagogue agrees with that. And there are still conservative synagogues today who do not Zoom. And so what are we doing for the high holidays? There are some synagogues that are pre-recording sections of the service or the entire service, and then just sending out the recording for people to watch whenever they want to watch. I don't think that's for me personally, and our religious committee agreed, no, there's a power still in doing something live. And Zoom is still live. It provides us the opportunity to do something live, and that's what we're going to do. But it gets to this idea from the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud that when you say that you have the right to interpret, then it's a matter of degree. And there are those who are more traditionalists, not wanting to change so much, and there are others who are willing to be creative in their interpretation. So that's why we have Reconstructionist, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox today, all on a different places in that spectrum of how to understand interpretation of Jewish law today. So all of that being said, I want to get to one little thing. So we have like 15 minutes left or so. This is all of this about the beginning of the Parsha. Again, if you have any thoughts or comments, just unmute yourself and ask. But let's turn to 10 pages ahead to page 1122. Page 1122, verse 3. Yeah. So this is chapter 23, verse 3, whatever edition of Chumash you're using, but it's page 1122 in the Eitz Chaim. So verse 3 says, Lo yavo mamzer bikahal Adonai, gam dur asiri, lo yavo lo bikahal Adonai. So I pronounced it in the modern Hebrew way, mamzer, but if I pronounced it in the Yiddish way, it would be mamzer. Okay, it's the same word. Okay, so now in Yiddish, it's an insult, calling somebody a mamzer, right? Not a nice thing to say about somebody. But it's based on the Torah, it's a legal definition. So in English, it says, no one misbegotten shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. None of his, what does that mean? Misbegotten. Okay, a mamzer technically, so the above the line commentary says the Hebrew mamzer, its meaning is uncertain, derivation from an Arabic and Ethiopic root meaning to be foul has been suggested. Mamzer is a technical term. Similar to the English term bastard, but not the same, because bastard technically is a child born out of wedlock. And technically, Jewishly, a child born out of wedlock is not a bastard. Okay, so if two people, man and a woman, who are eligible to be married to each other, have a child together and they're not married, the child is not a mamzer because they are eligible to be married to each other. A child becomes a mamzer if the father and biological father and mother were not allowed to be sexually intimate with one another. So the whole list in Leviticus in chapter 18 of prohibited relations, the child of all those relations would be considered a mamzer. A child of an adulterous relationship would be a mamzer. A child of either husband or wife, but in traditional Jewish law, if a wife did not receive a get from her previous marriage and has a child with a different husband, so in modern, in America, that would mean a couple has a civil divorce, but the woman did not have a get and she marries somebody else. So in America, that's legal to do that if you have a civil divorce. But Jewishly, that's a Jewish woman marrying a Jewish man, but they aren't married Jewishly. That child technically is a mamzer because the woman is still technically married to her previous husband, even though she had a civil divorce but didn't have a get. It's the get that makes it makes the divorce final Jewishly. So there are possibilities for a mamzer to be created. The problem is, well, one of the challenges is that the child is punished for something that is beyond the child's control. The child didn't ask to be born. The man and women did what they did illegally or against Jewish values, weren't necessarily illegal. So in other words, the civil divorce, there's nothing illegal about that, but Jewishly, there was something not Jewish about it. So it was anti-Jewish legal. So it's not the child's fault, but the child becomes a mamzer. And technically speaking, based on this, the rabbi said, a mamzer can only marry another mamzer. And their child is a mamzer. Their grandchild is a mamzer to the 10th generation. A mamzer only can marry another mamzer for 10 generations worth, which means forever. The gray paragraph on the bottom of the page, this portion has the most gray paragraphs of any portion because that's the most laws of any portion. The gray paragraph tells us practical halacha today. Hebrew mamzer, according to Jewish law, this refers only to the offspring of adultery or incest, not to those born out of wedlock, as I explained. The Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, that's CJLS, has adopted evidentiary procedures to render this rule inoperative. because it penalizes children for the sins of their parents, contrary to the teaching of Deuteronomy 24:16, which is the next chapter. So the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards then adds a layer of legality to this that essentially makes this impossible to, in other words, you have to prove, you would want to prove that you are a mamzer. And based on the evidence that the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is saying, nobody can realistically come up with that evidence. So therefore, there's no such thing as a mamzer anymore. So really the only cases that this, well, there would be, I mean, people do have adulterous relations and children are born of adulterous relations today. So that is a thing that does happen, and people do not bother getting a get, and they do get remarried. And in Reform, according to the Reform movement, couples don't need to have a get. Civil divorce is sufficient. So already the Reform movement goes against conservative Jewish law that way. And so there would be children born of relationships that are not according to conservative Jewish law, but the conservative movement has said we now declare mamzer inoperative. So this is another example of how Jewish law changes over time and what the conservative movement has done. Now, I don't know what the Orthodox movement has done or different branches of Orthodoxy have done about mamzers today. I really don't know. And I know that it is still a category that, that the Orthodox people deal with, but I'm not sure if they've gone to the extent that the conservative movement has as saying that that mamzer is inoperative. I don't think that they have done that, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to Google that. What does the Orthodox movement say about this? So with that, just understanding now the development of Jewish law and how values change over time. Any questions or comments before we end for today?
Yeah, going back to a mamzer. So the 10th generation of the mamzer would still be a mamzer?
Yes, that's
They'd
right.
all be mamzerim?
Only, right. So according to the Torah, a mamzer can only marry a fellow mamzer, and their child would become a mamzer automatically, even though they were, the two mamzers themselves are allowed to be married to each other. So they haven't done anything illegal, Jewishly. Their child automatically becomes a mamzer because the tag mamzer attaches to them and their descendants for 10 generations. So the possibility of keeping records for 10 generations, just think about this. How many Jews today can go back in their history 10 generations? There are some, but it's like a handful, right? There are some people who claim descended from the Vilna Gaon. Okay, so that's more than 10 generations. Or the Maharal of Prague. There are the Lowe family, L-O-W-E. That was the Maharal of Prague. There are people who claim to be descended from him. So few and far between, you have people who claim, and like there are people who claim to be 7 generations Jerusalemites. Okay, there are a few people in the world who can claim they're Jewish people in the world. They can go back 10 generations. And, you know, the daughters of the American Revolution, you know, claim they can get their ancestry back to that time, whatever, or the Mayflower. There are people like that around, but it's few and far between, especially Jewishly. It's impossible. So essentially what this law is saying is once a mamzer, always a mamzer forever. How practical this was. So did this really happen, that a child, that a mamzer child that a mamzer child had to marry a mamzer, another mamzer child? Yes, that would have happened in Jewish law. But would they have maintained that for a couple more generations? That I don't know. It's possible that that mamzer couple, right, child of a mamzer marrying another child of a mamzer, might have moved someplace else and then hid the fact that they were mamzers so that their child wouldn't be a mamzer anymore. That could very possibly be how that was dealt with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, folks. Have a good rest of the day. I'll see. We have Minyan tonight at 7:30. Stay safe and healthy, everybody.
All right.
Okay, Rabbi.
Thank you.
You too. Thank you.